Welcome to Crimson Clues, where shadows hide secrets and silence reveals the truth. Every story is a puzzle, and every clue takes you closer to the answer. Subscribe now, join the hunt, and let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. With her knitting bag swinging softly by her side, Miss Jane Marple walked the well-traveled path to the village institute as the twilight light was beginning to fade over St. Mary Me. As she got closer to the small brick structure that was the center of so many village events, she tugged her cardigan a bit tighter since the October air had the clear promise of winter. The warm glow of electric lights and the figures of women already seated around the long trestle tables were visible to her through the towering windows. The St. Mary Me Knitting Club always had a packed monthly meeting, but today was going to be especially memorable because of their ongoing charity drive and the mystery sea swap that had been promoted on the notice board for the past week. Sharp voice cried out, "Good evening, Miss Marple," and she pushed the heavy wooden door open. The club's chairwoman, Beatrix Morton, was standing close to the door, her gray hair drawn back in its traditional stiff bun, a clipboard in one hand, and a ruler in the other. "Arrive on time, as usual, and select your seat. We're going to have a busy evening." With a cheerful grin, Miss Marple looked around the well-known scene. With a hint of the tea preparations already starting at the far end of the room, the hall smelt like wool, polish, and beeswax. Approximately 12 ladies were dispersed among the tables, their diverse endeavors arranged in neat rows of needles, yarn, and designs in front of them. Mabel Finch, the owner of Finch's Wool and Haberdashery, was seated at the table closest to the window, her fat fingers immediately occupied with what looked like an especially complex cable design. As Miss Marple walked up, she glanced up with a warm grin, her shop bag next to her bulging with various notions and supplies. Mabel chirped, "Oh, Miss Marple, you simply must see the lovely new yarn I've just received," as she held up a skein of light blue wool from Scotland. It was an affordable yarn that was ideal for baby items. Miss Marple gathered herself at the table and took her own work out of her purse. "How thoughtful of you to remember," she said. "I have some vests that I need to finish for the donation box at the church. Baby clothing are always in high demand." She saw Hazel Trent sitting rather stiffly at a corner table across the room, bending over an ornate lace shawl with her dark hair flowing forward. Miss Marple could not quite get her finger on it, but there was something about the young woman's stance that indicated she was not quite at ease this evening. Ladies. Beatrix called the room to attention with a sharp clap of her hands. "If we could start the proceedings this evening. We're here tonight for our monthly charity drive and our unique mystery scheme swap, in addition to our normal delightful company, as you are all aware." The room echoed with a whisper of expectation. Hester Vale's gentle face was alight with curiosity as she glanced up from setting out cups and sauces by the tea table. Edith Pike, a silent widow who hardly spoke but her knitting was always perfect, stopped what she was doing to listen at the far end of the room. "Now, before we begin our mystery swap," Beatrice added, emphasizing the point with a tap of her ruler against the table, "I must remind everyone that we are expecting the greatest quality this evening. A 20-row tension swatch is needed for each mystery scheme, and I will be personally checking each one for evenness and gauge. We have to keep up our stellar reputation." Young Lucy Daring squirmed uneasily in her chair. She was barely out of her teens and one of the few members who liked crocheting more than knitting. She was new to the club and still felt a little overwhelmed by Beatrix's high expectations. Miss Marple threaded her needle and set to work on a small white waistcoat, her eyes taking in the evening's details while her fingers moved with familiar ease. From the adjacent room where the darts club convened, she could hear Inspector Slack's speech, broken by the thud of darts hitting the board and the occasional chuckle. Beatrice said, "The mystery skeins have been prepared according to our usual system," pointing to a large wicker basket full of brown paper packages with numbers written in black ink and tied with string. There is enough yarn in each packet for your swatch, and the fun part is, of course, not knowing what you'll get until you start using it. She started walking around the room after picking up the basket. Everyone will now select the appropriate package after drawing a number from the smaller basket. Remind yourself not to peek until you've chosen. As the women alternately pulled small folded papers from Beatrix's second basket, the room erupted in eager conversation. After drawing number 12, Miss Marple picked up a gift that seemed very soft despite its brown paper wrapping. Lucy Daring, number 7, held up her slip of paper. "Oh, number 7," Edith Pike remarked softly as she studied her own notepad. "Yes, but it appears that I drew number 3. As items were moved and paperwork were compared, there was a brief moment of bewilderment. With her ruler tapping impatiently on her hand, Beatrice scowled at the apparent confusion with the numbering system. "Really?" she mumbled. "This is the most erratic." "As you sketched it, Lucy, you take number 7. The system needs to be properly maintained." Miss Marple found herself observing the interactions between the various personalities in the room. As the evening fell into its comfortable rhythm of clicking needles and soft talk, as was her habit, Lady Bantry had come fashionably late, and she sat down with a flourish and a humorous tale about her most recent gardening mishap. As was customary when the knitting club got together, the Reverend and Mrs. Clement had also joined in, bringing the vicarage's cozy presents and polite questions about various parish issues. Beatrice abruptly said, "I do hope everyone remembers our strict policy about refreshments this evening," her voice plainly audible throughout the room. She directed her gaze particularly on Ha Vale, who was placing a plate of scone by the tea urn. "Nothing at all contains nuts. No peanuts, no hazelnuts, no almonds, nothing of that sort." Ha looked up, a little agitated. "Oh, Mrs. Morton, of course. I've been exceedingly careful. Even the butter is particularly marked as nut-free, and I made certain to check every component. There's a sign right here. You see?" she gestured toward a tiny, handwritten card that was leaning against the milk jug. Miss Marple took a quick look over the tea table, seeing the thoughtful setup and the clear consideration Ha had given to Beatrix's needs. Like everyone else in the hamlet, she was aware of Beatrix's severe nut allergy, which had resulted in the rescheduling of multiple social events to accommodate her demands. Now that the mystery presents had been dispersed, the room was filled with the soft rustle of paper as the women started to open their surprises. The evening air was filled with cries of excitement and wonder as different hues and textures were unveiled. Lucy said, "Oh, how lovely," as she held up a piece of what seemed like a soft, natural-colored linen blend. "However, it seems somewhat rigid. I wonder whether there is anything that can be done to address that." Hazel muttered, not looking up from her own unwrapping. "There are a lot of suggestions on the internet these days, but you have to be careful about taking advice from people you can't trust." When Miss Marple opened her own box, she found a gorgeously soft wool in a delicate pink hue that would be ideal for baby garments. She grinned with real happiness and began to cast on her 20 stitches for the required swatch. The evening went by in a calm manner as the women in the group were surrounded by the familiar cadence of village life, the cozy ambience that made these get-togethers so cherished by everyone who attended was produced by the clicking of needles, the pouring of tea, and the soft murmur of discussion. Beatrice circulated the room with her clipboard and ruler, checking in on everyone's progress and giving advice, albeit her ideas frequently had a sharp edge that made some members squirm. Miss Marple thought that her commitment to excellence was admirable, even if it wasn't always presented with the utmost tact. The swatches started to take shape as the first hour went by, and the mysterious skeins shared their secrets. Miss Marple was especially intrigued by the different methods that each knitter used, observing the minor customs and inclinations that contributed to the individuality of each knitter's technique. She reflected happily that it was turning out to be a very typical evening at St. Mary Me, full of the straightforward joys of pleasant company and productive work. How incorrect that evaluation would turn out to be, she would later realize. Chapter 2. Nut-Free Tea. When Beatrice Morton got up from her chair, the clock on the institution wall had just struck 8. With the ruler still securely in her right hand, she looked around the room with the satisfaction of a general assessing well-behaved soldiers, noting each member's progress on their mystery swatch. "Ladies," she declared, her voice retaining its customary tone of command, "this seems like a good time for our refreshment break, but before we enjoy Ha's wonderful hospitality, I feel compelled to stress once more how important it is that we adhere to our rigorous nut-free policy tonight." She moved deliberately in the direction of the tea table, where Ha Vale was already using both hands to raise the big brown teapot. On a plate with flowers, the scone were arranged in tidy rows with little plates of jam and what seemed like fresh butter. "I don't want to come across as too cautious," Beatrix added, focusing an extremely intense gaze on Ha. "However, as you are all aware, for someone with my level of sensitivity, even the slightest hint of nuts can be extremely harmful. I sincerely hope your preparations have been meticulous." Ha's sweet face became a shade of pink. "You don't have to worry at all, Mrs. Morton. I have double-checked each and every ingredient. The butter is clearly marked as Nutri and comes from Marks & Spencer. Additionally, I prepared my own strawberry preserve, using only fruit and sugar to make the jam. The mill from which the scone's flour was sourced explicitly declares that no nuts are processed in their facility." She pointed to her nice school mistress handwriting on her carefully lettered sign that declared completely nut-free refreshments. "The only ingredients of the scone itself are flour, butter, milk, and a little sugar," Hester added solemnly. "To make sure there wouldn't be any contamination from earlier baking, I even brought my own wooden spoon and mixed them in a bowl that I had specifically cleaned for the event." Looking up from her knitting, Miss Marple saw Beatrix's face soften a little at this detailed explanation. A few years previously, when a tragic occurrence at the church fete had necessitated Dr. Haydock's rapid attention, the entire community had learnt that the chairwoman's allergy was indeed severe. Beatrice responded, "Well then," in a little softer tone, "I guess we can move forward, but I do hope that everyone will be aware of the possibility of cross-contamination. Instead of using your own knives or forks, please utilize the serving spoons that are provided." As they approached the tea table, the knitters started to put down their work. Noting that she had finished almost 15 rows of precisely even stockinette stitch, Miss Marple gently set her pink swatch on the table. The second mystery project was in various stages of development throughout the room. Lucy Daring's linen yarn looked hard and challenging to work with, as if she were having some trouble with it. As though to ease its texture, she had been rubbing the strand between her fingers from time to time. Miss Marple said softly, "Having difficulties, dear," as she walked past Lucy's chair. Lucy said, "Oh, it's nothing serious," but her scowl gave the impression that she didn't mean it. Simply said, "This linen is quite stiff. I've read online that applying oil to plant fibers helps soften them, but I'm not sure if it would be suitable for a swatch that Mrs. Morton will be looking at, though perhaps traditional ways are the safest when one is unsure." Miss Marple agreed modestly that the internet is a great resource. While Mrs. Clement nodded empathetically and offered some kind remark, Lady Bantry was regaling Hester with a usually humorous description of her cook's most recent culinary failure at the tea table. The Reverend had joined Inspector Slack's sinister game in the next room, and his sporadic cries of relief or surprise were a welcome counterpoint to the female conversation. As someone used to serving customers, Mabel Finch hustled around with her typical efficiency, offering to help pour tea and generally being helpful. She had brought along a little bag of shop samples and notions, which she had put on a side table for anyone who might be interested. After accepting a cup of tea and a scone from Huz's cautious hands, Beatrice said, "Oh, Mabel, you've brought those needle conditioners again, I see. It was very considerate of you to share them with the club." Mabel cheerfully remarked, "It's nothing at all," pointing to a tiny brown bottle among her belongings. I felt the samples the traveling salesperson left could be helpful. That unpleasant squeak can be avoided with just a dab of bamboo needles. You know, noting with approval how carefully Ha had prepared everything to avoid any chance of contamination, Miss Marple took her own cup of tea and chose a small quantity of scones. The jam was certainly beautifully clear, with whole strawberries visible in the preserve, and the butter was fresh and sweet. She had just gone back to her seat when Beatrice started talking again, her voice adopting the tone she reserved for major announcements. "I think I should point out that we will need to take care of some club business in the upcoming weeks before we get started with our evening's work. In particular, I will be providing a thorough accounting of our yarn fund. Expenses at the meeting the following month." There was a slight change in the room's mood. After decades of studying human nature, Miss Marple's senses were honed to such shifts, and she observed as multiple faces turned to Mabel Finch, whose happy smile appeared to slightly freeze. "An accounting?" Mabel inquired. Her voice was a little higher than normal, although it wasn't really required. "Everyone is aware of how meticulously I oversee the club's purchases, and all of the receipts are in perfect order." Smoothly, Beatrice said, "I'm sure they are," and took her teacup back to her seat. "However, regular review of all financial matters is required by good practice. Nothing personal, you know, but you have to follow the right protocols." She resumed knitting, the circular bamboo needles shining in the electric lights. She had been making great work on her swatch, and her mystery yarn had turned out to be a beautiful wool blend in a soft gray color. Miss Marple saw that Beatrice had adopted the practice of moistening the yarn end with her lips while joining a new length, which is typical of many knitters. After years of dealing with wool and thread, it was one of those tiny, unconsciously performed actions that came naturally. "Now then," Beatrice said, relaxing back into her regular pattern of crocheting while talking. "Tonight we really need to stay focused on technique. I'll be closely examining each swatch to make sure it's even and tension-free." She took a moment to look over her work, examining it under the light to look for any flaws. Before moving on to the next row, she unconsciously wet the end of her yarn with her tongue. Slowly, the talk shifted back to more relaxed subjects. The other members' muted responses suggested that there was some history behind the new pattern. Hazel Trent had been forming, but Miss Marple was unable to fully understand it. Edith Pike, as usual, worked in quiet concentration, her needles moving with the steady rhythm of someone who had been knitting since childhood. Beatrice cleared her throat for the first time maybe 10 minutes later. When Miss Marple looked up from her own work, she saw the chairwoman with a perplexed expression on her face as she used her free hand to rub her throat. She cleared her throat again, more aggressively this time. "Tatrick, excuse me," her voice a little thick. "I seem to have developed a bit of a tickle." After crocheting for a minute or two more, Miss Marple saw that she appeared to be having some difficulty breathing. Her cheeks, which had been a normal color, were starting to turn a frightening shade of pink. Ha yelled nervously from the tea table, "Mrs. Morton, are things going well for you? You appear somewhat flushed." Beatrice raised both hands to her throat and stopped knitting. Her face was turning a characteristic crimson that Miss Marple recognized with increasing alarm, and her breathing was now noticeably wheezy. I can't." With a surprise, Beatrice stumbled out of her chair. "Something's wrong." Unable to breathe correctly, abrupt activity erupted in the room. Lady Bantry threw her teacup over as she leaped to her feet. With a worried expression on her face, Mrs. Clement hurried over to Beatrice. "It's her allergy," exclaimed Mabel Finch. "Someone fetch Dr. Doc immediately." Beatrice was now swaying dangerously, and every time she tried to breathe, she made harsh, strained noises, and Miss Marple approached her quietly but quickly. The woman's eyes were starting to water a lot, and her face was getting redder and puffier. Pointing a quivering finger toward the tea table, the scone gasped, "Huh! Oh my gosh, could there have been nuts in the scone somehow?" However, I was quite cautious, extremely cautious. As the sound of chairs scraping and worried voices filled the air, Lucy Daring had rushed to the adjacent room and was frantically yelling for Dr. Haydock. Inspector Slack was coming quickly, his footsteps heavy. By the time Dr. Haydock showed up, his countenance grave with professional worry and his medical bag in hand, with her face horribly swollen and her breathing shallow, Beatrice Morton had fallen on the Institute Hall's gleaming floor. Once filled with the soft sounds of clicking needles and soft conversation, the room now smelled of polish and wool. Miss Marple, however, smelled something else beneath those familiar aromas, something with a subtle sweetness that reminded her of roasted nuts. Miss Marple found herself observing the scene with fresh eyes as Dr. Haydock worked furiously over Beatrix's still figure. She looked down at the bamboo needles Beatrice had been using, lying unused on the table next to her incomplete swatch. The smooth bamboo tips glinted strangely in the brilliant electric light, as though they had been touched by grease or oil. No one else seemed to have noticed the detail in the middle of the current turmoil. Chapter 3. Apply oil on bamboo. The silence that follows tragedy had descended upon the Institute Hall. Beatrice Morton's acute allergic reaction had advanced too quickly for medical intervention to be helpful, despite Dr. Hawk's best efforts. While Inspector Slack walked about the room with the methodical precision of a man who had witnessed too many such sights, her still form lay covered by Mrs. Clement's knitting shawl. Slack made the strong announcement, "Nobody is to touch anything." But there was a hint of fatigue in his voice. "Until we can ascertain precisely what transpired here tonight, this chamber is now sealed." With their faces white with shock and astonishment, the remaining knitting club members crowded close to the windows. Havale sat on a chair with her head in her hands, still repeating, "But I was so careful, so very careful," while Lady Bantry attempted to console her with gentle pats on the shoulder. But Miss Marple had silently taken up her position next to the table, where Beatrice's work was still lying discarded. She examined the scene in front of her without disrupting anything, moving with the deliberate movements of someone who recognized the value of keeping evidence intact. "Maybe," she continued quietly, "it would be good if we had a closer look at Mrs. Morton's knitting supplies. Her needles appear to have a rather peculiar quality." Slack glanced up from the notebook he was using to jot down the evening's essential information. "Miss Marple, what's so unusual?" "The bamboo tips have a pretty shiny appearance, almost as though they have been treated with oil or conditioner, if you were to look at them." Slack approached and looked at the round needles next to Beatrix's incomplete swatch. In the electric light, indeed, a thin, sparkling sheen caught the light in a peculiarly persistent way on the smooth bamboo surface. He responded, "Now that you mention it," slowly, "it appears that something is there. However, how would that relate to her allergic response? The meal must have been the issue." Miss Marple was cautious not to touch the needles, but she leaned a little closer. The tops of the bamboo seemed to smell very faintly. It smelled warm and nutty, very different from the lanolin one may associate with wool knitting. "You'll see a tiny amber drop if you look at the ferrule of that left needle," she whispered softly. "It appears to be some form of oil." Slack took a fresh handkerchief out of his pocket and dabbed at the small droplet that Miss Marple had pointed to. When he placed the cloth against a sheet of white paper from his notebook, it left a noticeable oily halo that seemed to spread and persist, rather than being absorbed. He concurred, saying, "That's definitely some kind of oil, but I still don't see how needle oil would cause what happened to Mrs. Morton." The notions table, which Mabel Finch had arranged with her shop samples, caught Miss Marple's attention. Among the many items dispersed, there was a squat brown bottle with a basic white label. "Maybe we might look at that needle conditioner bottle," she said. Mrs. Morton appeared to know how to use it, and Mrs. Finch had brought it up earlier this evening. Needle Stuff L was written in beautiful black letters on the bottle. Slack cautiously raised it, observing that there was a thin thread of oil visible around the rim, indicating that the cap had been used recently. He yelled, "Mrs. Finch," to Mabel, who was sitting among the other startled knitters. "This needle conditioner bottle. Could you explain it to me?" Mabel's eyes were rimmed in red when she gazed up. "Oh, that? Yes, you know, the traveling salesman. Brought something fresh to stop bamboo needles from squeaking. Only needs a small dab on the tips. I figured the club members might find it helpful. Additionally, lanolin is represented by the L on the label." That was what he told me, of course. In any case, the bamboo is meant to be conditioned using only lanolin. Petrick's knitting bag sat open on the table, and Miss Marple stepped closer. Inside, among the normal collection of scissors, stitch markers, and spare yarn, was a little auto-injector pen, still in its protective container. She gestured to the medical equipment and added, "Inspector, you might want to examine this as well. It appears to be Mrs. Morton's emergency medication." Although the safety cap had been taken off, Slack pointed out that the injector itself had never been turned on. There were tiny indentation marks on the plastic cover, as though someone had bitten down on it in a panic. He watched grimly as she attempted to use it, but something went awry. Maybe there wasn't time, or maybe she couldn't handle it in her agitated state. Miss Marple gave a contemplative nod. Mrs. Morton has a reputation for being quite methodical. She seemed unable to use her emergency medication when it was needed, despite always having it on hand. She returned her focus to Beatrice's knitting endeavor. The working yarn was still on the ball, and the gray wool swatch was lying just where it had been left. Miss Marple was especially intrigued by the apparent handling of the yarn. "Observe the indications of moisture on Mrs. Morton's yarn," she said slack. "It connects to the main ball there." When attaching new lengths of yarn, knitters frequently wet the end with their mouth. The inspector nodded, but it was clear from his face that he had not yet realized the importance of this observation. Miss Marple muttered, almost to herself, 3 habits. Mrs. Finch's generosity in giving useful supplies for the club, Mrs. Morton's severe nut allergy, and her propensity to wet yarn ends while knitting. She stopped and scanned the room as intently as if she were assembling a difficult problem. Even though the tea table had been properly inspected and nothing unusual had been discovered among his meticulously prepared treats, the faint smell of roasted nuts still appeared to linger in the air. Miss Marple remarked softly, "I think we might discover that this tragedy was not at all caused by contaminated food, Inspector. The answer may lie in those innocent-seeming knitting supplies." Slack appeared doubtful. "You're saying that knitting needles were purposefully poisoned?" "I think that's a bit unrealistic, Miss Marple. Not exactly poisoned. But think about this. Anyone using that oil on their needles would be unwittingly touching a deadly allergy if someone were to replace the innocuous lanolin in the conditioning bottle with another oil, perhaps one made from nuts. However, what impact would that have on Mrs. Morton? The needles weren't being eaten by her." Miss Marple pointed to the discarded knitting. Mrs. Morton had a habit of using her lips to moisten her yarn. She trailed off in a significant way if she had handled that yarn and then touched it to her mouth, and if she had oiled her needles with nut oil. The inspector's face darkened as he started to realize the consequences. "Are you implying that someone was aware of her behaviors and took advantage of them?" "But it is feasible, of course. We would have to test that bottle to find out what it truly contains and do a more comprehensive inspection of the needles to look for allergy residues." Miss Marple scanned the room again, observing the looks of the remaining members of the knitting group. Despite the fact that each woman was in her own bubble of shock and sorrow, She couldn't help but observe the minute variations in their responses. Some, like Havale, appeared to be consumed by self-loathing and introspection. Others, such as Mrs. Clement and Lady Bantry, showed the surprised grief that comes with losing a lifelong friend. However, there was something about Mabel Finch's silent, motionless sitting that spoke to a very other kind of worry. Finally, Miss Marple stated, "We will have to look at everything very carefully. The most lethal intents can occasionally be hidden behind the most innocent-looking thing." Chapter 4. Two Swaps. The following morning brought a gray drizzle that seemed to echo the somber mood hanging over St. Mary Me. Inspector Slack had returned to the Institute Hall early, accompanied by a constable and several items of equipment for a more thorough examination of the previous evening's events. Miss Marple arrived shortly after 9 o'clock, having spent a restless night turning over the details of Beatrix Morton's tragic death. She found the inspector carefully photographing the abandoned knitting projects, each still positioned exactly where it had been left the night before. "I've been thinking about those mystery skeins," she said without preamble, particularly about the confusion with the numbering system that occurred during the drawing. Slack looked up from his camera. "The mix-up with the tickets, you mean, seemed like ordinary confusion to me. These sorts of social events rarely run smoothly, perhaps. But I wonder if we might examine the tickets themselves more closely. And the brown paper packages as well." They moved to where the remaining mystery skins sat in their basket. Most had been unwrapped the previous evening, their contents revealed and their papers discarded, but a few remained untouched after the tragedy had interrupted the proceedings. "Now then," Miss Marple said, settling her spectacles more firmly on her nose. "Young Lucy mentioned that she had drawn number 7, but I distinctly recall Mrs. Pike saying something about numbers being muddled." Slack nodded, consulting his notes from the previous evening. Mrs. Pike drew number 3 initially, and Miss Daring got number 7, but there was some confusion, and they ended up sorting it out between themselves. Miss Marple moved to where Lucy's abandoned work lay on the table. The linen yarn that had emerged from package number 7 was spread beside her partially completed swatch, and the brown paper wrapping lay crumpled nearby. "If you would examine this paper," she said, smoothing out the wrapping carefully, "you'll notice something rather interesting." The paper bore the number 7 written in black ink, but as Slack looked more closely, he could see that there was something odd about the marking. The number seemed to lean distinctly to the left, quite different from the other tickets he had observed. "That's a left-handed writer," he said with growing interest. "But most of the other numbers were written by someone right-handed." "Precisely. And if you look here," Miss Marple pointed to a corner of the paper, "there's a small grease stain and what appears to be a price mark made with pencil, the sort of marking one might find on tissue paper from a shop." They turned their attention to the small basket that had held the numbered tickets. Several crumpled papers remained inside, and Slack carefully smoothed them out on the table. "Look here," he said after a moment. "There are 2 number 7s. This first one is written in the same hand as most of the others, but this second one definitely shows that left-handed slant you mentioned." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I believe we may find that someone prepared an extra ticket and substituted it during the drawing process. But that raises the question of why anyone would go to such trouble over a simple knitting exercise." They moved to examine Lucy's mystery skein more closely. The linen blend yarn was indeed rather stiff, as she had complained the previous evening, but there was something else about it that caught Miss Marle's attention. "Feel the texture of this yarn," she suggested to Slack. "Compare it to the linen in that other package over there." The inspector handled both skeins carefully, noting the difference immediately. "This one feels slightly tacky, almost as if it's been treated with something." Miss Daring mentioned that she'd read about softening linen with oil. "I wonder if she attempted to treat this yarn before the meeting." As if summoned by their conversation, Lucy herself appeared at the door of the hall. her young face drawn with worry and sleeplessness. "Oh, Miss Marple, Inspector Slack, I hope you don't mind my coming back. I couldn't stop thinking about poor Mrs. Morton, and I wondered if there was anything I could do to help. Actually, my dear, you might be able to clarify something for us," Miss Marple said gently. "Your mystery yarn from last evening, the linen blend. Did you treat it with anything before the meeting?" Lucy's face brightened slightly. "Oh yes, I did try something I read about online. The internet suggested that you could soften linen by rubbing it with oil. So I tried it yesterday afternoon, but I only used olive oil from the kitchen. Mother grows herbs in it, so I knew it was perfectly pure." "And you're quite certain it was olive oil, nothing else?" "Absolutely certain. I took it from the bottle in our kitchen cupboard. Extra virgin olive oil, it said on the label." Slack made notes while Miss Marple continued her gentle questioning. "Now, about the ticket drawing last evening, can you recall exactly how you came to receive package number 7? Lucy frowned, clearly trying to remember the details. "Well, I drew a ticket from Mrs. Morton's basket, and it had the number 7 written on it. But then Mrs. Pike said something about having number 3, and there seemed to be some confusion about which packages belonged to whom. Did Mrs. Morton herself draw a ticket?" "Oh yes, she drew one first as the chairwoman. I think she had number 3 initially, but then somehow she ended up with number 7 instead. Mrs. Morton was quite particular about following proper procedures, so she seemed a bit flustered by the mix-up." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Slack. "So Mrs. Morton originally drew number 3, but ended up with number 7, the package that contained the oil-treated linen." "I suppose so, yes, though I'm not sure exactly how the switching happened. Everything was a bit chaotic with so many people drawing tickets at once." After Lucy had left, promising to return if she remembered any other details, Miss Marple and Slack continued their examination of the evidence. "It's beginning to look as though someone deliberately engineered the situation so that Mrs. Morton would receive that particular package," Slack observed. "Indeed, and the fact that the linen had been pre-treated with oil, even innocent olive oil, would have made it feel different from ordinary yarn. Someone familiar with textiles would have noticed that immediately." Miss Marple picked up the brown paper that had wrapped package number 7, studying the pencil mark more closely. "This pricing notation," she said, pointing to the faint markings, "has a very particular style, the way the numbers are formed, and that distinctive fraction mark. I believe I've seen similar markings before. Where would that have been?" "In Finch's wool and haberdashery. Mrs. Finch has a very characteristic way of marking her prices on tissue paper. She uses a particular type of pencil and has a distinctive method of writing fractions." Slack looked up sharply. "You're suggesting Mrs. Finch prepared that package?" "I'm suggesting that the paper came from her shop at the very least. Whether she prepared the package herself or whether someone else used her materials remains to be determined." Miss Marple moved to examine the remaining evidence with renewed interest. The more she studied the details of the evening's events, the more convinced she became that Beatrix Morton's death had been carefully planned, using the innocent rituals of the knitting club as a cover for murder. 2 swaps, she murmured to herself. The ticket swap that ensured Mrs. Morton received the treated yarn, and perhaps another swap as well. The substitution of genuine lanolin with something far more dangerous. The gray morning light filtering through the institute windows seemed to highlight every detail with stark clarity, and Miss Marple felt that familiar sensation of pieces falling into place that always accompanied her most successful investigations. Someone had used the cozy familiar world of the knitting club to commit a very clever murder indeed. Chapter 5. The Not-So-Schoon. Dr. Haydock arrived at the institute shortly before midday, carrying his black medical bag and bearing the grim attitude that accompanied his more serious professional obligations. The results of the doctor's investigation would be essential to pinpointing the precise cause of Beatrix Morton's death. as Inspector Slack had asked for an initial assessment of the situation. Looking at his notes, he declared, "Classical anaphylaxis. Sadly, textbook case. The quick onset, respiratory discomfort, and swelling are all indicative of a severe nut allergy." Miss Marple, who had stayed in the hall during the investigations of the morning, glanced up from where she had been silently examining the tea table arrangements, which were just as they had been left the night before. "And doctor, you didn't find any other relevant factors? No physical harm or symptoms of poisoning?" "Absolutely none." Mrs. Morton's response was undoubtedly caused by an allergy, most likely nuts of some kind. How she got in touch with them when everyone was so cautious about the refreshments is the question. In the dreary morning light, Slack pointed to the tea table where Havel's scone was still sitting on their flower-patterned dish, looking quite fain. "Those scone have undergone extensive testing. Not a trace of nuts in any of them," he remarked. "The flour that Mrs. Vale used, the jam, and the butter were all spotless." Dr. Haydock gave a nod of approval. Mrs. Vale had good reason to exercise such caution. Mrs. Morton's reactions were always very severe when I treated her in the past. The slightest pollution might have been lethal. Miss Marple approached the tea table with a keen eye for details that others might have missed. There were tidy rows of teacups and condiments. Has meticulously lettered, "Strictly nut-free refreshment." Sign was still leaning against the big brown teapot, and the milk jug was standing next to the sugar dish. "Dr. Haydock," she uttered slowly, "you stated that you have previously handled Mrs. Morton's allergic responses. Did ingesting always cause them, or may skin contact result in comparable symptoms, even though they were often less than what we witnessed last night? Contact reactions were undoubtedly feasible with someone as sensitive as Mrs. Morton." "Why are you asking?" Miss Marple took a while to respond. Rather, she was looking at a tea cozy that was knitted and covered the big brown pot. The cozy looked to have been hand-crocheted in a traditional manner and was made of bright yellow wool with little blue flowers. "Inspector," she uttered abruptly, "maybe I could ask you to check out this tea cozy. The inner lining looks to have some initials embroidered on it." Slack carefully raised the cozy, exposing the white cotton lining with the letters MF embroidered. In a small, precise font, "Mabel Finch," he said at once. Thus, in addition to the needle conditioner, Mrs. Finch also contributed this. In fact, if you look closely, the region near the spout appears to be fairly damp, as though someone had been handling the teapot a lot, possibly assisting with the pouring. Dr. Haydock observed this conversation with increasing curiosity. "You believe that rather than the food itself, Mrs. Morton may have been exposed to the allergen during the tea service?" Miss Marple went to look at the needle conditioner bottle that was still sitting among the samples from Mabel's business. In the clearer sunshine, several elements about the label were more obvious. "I suppose you know what lanolin is, Dr. Hawk. Could you describe the smell of this substance to us?" With professional attention, the doctor sniffed the contents of the container after carefully removing the cap. He said, "That's not lanolin," right away. "Lanolin smells a lot like wool, almost like a sheep. This smells really different. Actually, a little crazy. Quite nice, but definitely not lanolin." As Miss Marple continued to inspect the tea table, Slack took notes. A tiny smear of the same oily substance that had been discovered on Beatrix's needles was visible on one of the stitch markers from Mabel's collection. She noted that it seemed that someone had applied a substantial amount of this so-called needle conditioner. "Look, Inspector, there's no denying that this stitch marker has been handled with greasy hands." Returning to Beatrix's abandoned work, Miss Marple took a closer look at the tension swatch. She noticed that, in bright light, 2 rows, in particular, had a little different texture than the others, as though the yarn had been treated at those exact spots. She concluded grimly by saying, "Dr. Haddock, if someone handled yarn with greasy hands that contained nut residue, and if that yarn were then moistened and touched to the lips repeatedly, The allergen would be transferred directly to the mouth and absorbed through the mucous membranes. In actuality, it would be a far more effective delivery method than mere skin contact. Slack was starting to appear quite uneasy. "Do you mean that nut oil was purposefully used to contaminate Mrs. Morton's knitting supplies?" Miss Marple said. Quite quietly, "I'm suggesting that we need to look very carefully at who had opportunity to handle both the needle conditioner and Mrs. Morton's work." Her gaze shifted to the gathered evidence, seeing that the several red herrings appeared to be pointing in different directions. Hazel Trent was visibly resentful of Beatrice over a previous disagreement, involving a disqualified pattern that had obviously produced animosity. One example was Lucy's harmless oil treatment experiment, which could have been interpreted as suspicious. Additionally, Edith Pike had a reserved manner that might be used to hide a variety of personal grievances. Miss Marple thought that this case was interesting because it showed how many completely innocent activities could look suspicious when examined closely. Mrs. Trent's bitterness, Miss Daring's oil therapy, and even Mrs. Pike's customary silence. If someone was searching for a convenient suspect, any of them could offer motivation or an opportunity. Dr. Haydock moved quickly as he packed his medical bag. "Well, whatever the approach, I can tell you that Mrs. Morton died from nut allergy, clear and simple. The signs I saw rule out any other cause of death." After the doctor had left, Miss Marple and Inspector Slack started their meticulous investigation of the evidence. The tiny brown bottle with the deceptive label appeared to be the focal point of everything. However, circumstantial evidence alone would not be sufficient to prove willful substitution. "The question we must ask ourselves," Miss Marple said as she carefully rewrapped Beatrix's knitting in clean paper, "is not just who had opportunity to substitute the contents of that bottle, but who would have known enough about Mrs. Morton's habits to predict exactly how the contamination would be transferred." She took one last look at the tea table, seeing the thoughtful placement of the cups and how everything had been set out for the comfort of the club members. Someone who could move freely around the room, providing helpful assistance without raising suspicions, and who was aware of Mrs. Morton's severe allergy, the knitting club's routines, and her unique yarn-working habits. They were getting ready to depart the Institute Hall as the gray afternoon light started to wane. Miss Marple hoped that tomorrow would bring more inquiries and more definitive answers about who had turned a nice evening of knitting for Cherry into a murderous opportunity. The solution was starting to take shape in her thoughts, though, and she could already feel the familiar stirring of comprehension. Chapter 6: The Bottle's Monogram. With the autumn sunlight pouring through the big windows of the Institute Hall, the third day of the investigation began bright and clear. Miss Marple came early, with a little magnifying lens and the resolute look of one who meant to scrutinize every detail with the greatest care. Inspector Slack had already arrived after reflecting on the case's increasing complexity for a long period the night before. He was appreciative of Miss Marple's systematic approach to sorting through the many options, as the evidence seemed to point in multiple ways at once. Without introducing herself, Miss Marple declared, "I've been thinking about that bottle," referring to the label and the potential for alteration. She walked over to the evidence table and carefully placed the brown bottle of purported needle conditioner under the strong morning light streaming in through the eastern windows. "I think you'll discover some fascinating information on the label, Inspector, that wasn't apparent under electric light." Slack followed her, staring at the label of needle conditioner L, written in crisp black script on white paper. It looked completely normal at first, but as his eyes grew used to the intense natural light, he started to recognize what Miss Marple had. He said, "There's something underneath," slowly. Ghost letters, as if another label had been removed, and this one pasted over it. "You can just make out the curvature of what might be a G if you look at the edge here. The tail of what might have been a D was there. A portion of the original label was taken off." Miss Marple gave him her magnifying glass, and the ghostly letters were clearer in their enlarged vision. In addition to what looked like half letters that might spell oil, the suggestion of was plainly visible. Slack said, "Ground oil," suddenly realizing. Someone relabeled a bottle of groundnut oil to make. It appeared to be lanolin. It's exactly the kind of stuff that would kill someone with Mrs. Morton's severe allergy. And groundnut oil, as I'm sure you know, is simply another name for peanut oil. They looked at the screw cap on the bottle, which Miss Marple looked at very carefully. She could see via the magnifying lens that someone had used what looked like a sharp tool to etch a small letter M into the metal. That's the kind of mark a knitting needle would make, she noted, and it's the kind of thing one might do to identify one's own supplies when sharing them with others. As Miss Marple continued to examine the physical evidence, Slack took thorough notes. A number of Mabel's stitch markers were on the table next to them, and one of them had a noticeable smear of the same greasy material that Beatrix had discovered on his bamboo needles. It seems that the person who applied this fake conditioner did not take extra care to prevent contaminating other objects. According to Miss Marple, this stitch marker has clearly been handled by someone with oily fingers. Now let's take another look at Beatrix's abandoned knitting effort. 2 rows of the tension swatch displayed a texture that was noticeably different from the surrounding piece, as Miss Marple could tell in the strong daylight. Look here, Inspector. The yarn used to knit these specific rows seems to have been handled with care. In contrast to the rest of the piece, the wool has a faint sheen to it. Slack examined the data with increasing trepidation. Miss Marple, you're making a strong case for intentional murder, but we must also take into account the alternative options. What about Miss Daring's oil experiment that mysteriously failed, or Miss Trent's evident animosity toward Mrs. Morton? Miss Marple gave a contemplative nod. Indeed, an investigator could be easily misled by a number of red herrings. A person who is unfamiliar with the facts may see Miss Daring's naive attempt to soften linen with olive oil suspect, and Miss Trent's complaint about her disqualified pattern offers an obvious reason for animosity. She stopped by the window and gazed out at the quiet village street, where daily life went on as usual, unaffected by the horror that had taken place inside these walls. Then there's Mrs. Pike's usual silence, which could be a cover for a variety of personal grievances. People frequently believe that those who are quiet are carrying hidden grudges. Slack looked at his notebook, in which he had been writing down information about every member of the knitting club. Oil may have been brought to the conference by any of them. In the bustle of the evening, Mrs. Morton's needles might have been in the hands of any of them. It's true, but think about this. Whoever substituted the contents of that bottle had to know many very particular things. They had to first learn about Mrs. Morton's acute allergy and the precise triggers. The second thing they needed to know was her knitting habits, specifically her propensity to moisten yarn ends with her lips. Miss Marple returned to the evidence table, where the several objects silently narrated their tale of meticulous preparation and willful deceit. Third, they needed access to both the original bottle and a suitable alternative oil. Last but not least, they required the freedom to move around the space and provide beneficial assistance without raising any red flags. Noting once more the unique pricing pencil lines on the brown paper wrapping, she took up one of the mystery skein packages. Inspector, these markings are really distinctive. The specific method of fractional notation and the way the numbers are constructed. This particular strategy is not new to me. Where might that have been? Infant's haberdashery and wool. Mrs. Finch marks prices on tissue paper in a very unique way. After years of working as a shopkeeper, she has created her own shorthand method and utilizes a unique pencil. Slack's eyes sprang up. Therefore, just because the paper came from her store doesn't mean she made the package herself. No, of course. However, it does imply that the person who prepared it had access to her shop supplies. And think about how things happened. How the duplicate ticket made sure Mrs. Morton got the oil-treated linen yarn. how the helpful offer of needle conditioner turned out to be peanut oil, and how the general aid with tea service created several chances for contamination. Miss Marple took another look at the tea cozy with the MF monogram and noted how wet it was still near the spout. Someone who was well versed in the knitting club's procedures, someone who could provide assistance and materials without coming across as inappropriate, someone who had the opportunity and the expertise to plan this incredibly cunning murder. The evidence table was covered with sharp shadows as the morning sun rose higher, making every detail stand out. Miss Marple experienced that recognizable feeling of things coming together that was always present in her most fruitful investigations. However, she warned Slack, we must be extremely careful not to draw hasty judgments. Regardless of how we feel about the people involved, we must let the data speak for itself and follow it wherever it leads. Miss Marple couldn't help but think about how the comfortable, familiar world of village life could hide such meticulous planning and deadly intent as they got ready to leave the Institute Hall for another day of investigation. She was resolved to see that unfortunate Beatrix Morton received justice after someone had committed murder using the harmless customs of charitable knitting. Chapter 7. The Wool Shop at Midnight. Miss Marple had knitted quietly in her sitting room that night, reflecting on the strange circumstances of Beatrix Morton's death. She was still bothered by something about the case, a persistent feeling that there were more bits of proof out there just waiting to be found. She made a choice that would have shocked anyone who believed they were familiar with the customs of old village women at almost 11 o'clock. She called Slack, the inspector. I hope I'm not bothering you at this late hour, but Mrs. Finch's shop has been on my mind, Inspector. Would it be worthwhile to have someone watch the property tonight? Slack spoke in a tired yet attentive tone. Miss Marple, what kind of eye? Are you anticipating a certain event? It seems to me that someone could want to tie up any loose ends that might cause problems. The kind of cleaning that's best done when no one is looking. In less than an hour, Sergeant Lake had settled in for what he hoped would be a peaceful night's vigil, quietly across from Finch's wall and haberdashery. With its cheerful window display of autumn yarns hardly visible in the dim moonlight, the shop remained silent and dark among the row of Hamlet enterprises. At almost midnight, a figure emerged at the shop's side entrance, moving with the deliberate stealth of someone who did not want to be noticed. With increasing curiosity, Sergeant Lake observed Mabel Finch entering her own building while carrying what looked to be a sizable canvas sack. After waiting for a few minutes, the policeman finally arrived, allowing Mrs. Finch to fully immerse herself in whatever it was that had dragged her out at such an hour. His final pounding on the door caused a startlingly loud reverberation throughout the silent store. Sergeant Lake here, Mrs. Finch, may I speak? The ensuing hush was so long that Lake started to question whether he had seen the person coming in his mind. At last, Mabel's voice shouted out with a fake smile as footsteps came closer to the door. What a surprise, Sergeant Lake. I was just tidying up a little bit late. Shop work is like that, you know. Something constantly needs to be taken care of. Her normally tidy appearance was a little unkempt as she opened the door, as Lake could see. Her hair had fallen out of its usual pins, and her cardigan had smudges that strangely resembled dust and rubble. Mrs. Finch, isn't it a little late for cleaning? Would it be okay if I came in to see what you were working on? One lamp by the back counter lit the shop's interior dimly, casting pools of light and shadow among the familiar yarn and idea displays. What instantly attracted Lake's attention was the canvas sack that lay open near the rear of the business, loaded with what appeared to be various kinds of rubbish and paper. Mabel hurriedly answered, just clearing out some old stock, and stepped forward to stand between the sack and the sergeant. You are aware of how these things build up. It is preferable to properly dispose of them rather than allow them to clog the storage spaces. With professional attention, Lake walked over to the sack and noted the assortment of things inside. A roll of the special pencil he had seen used for price marking, brown tissue paper of the kind used to package items, a few tiny paper tickets, unnumbered and ready to be numbered. "Interesting assortment of trash," he said gently. "Would you mind if I took a closer look?" Was there a tiny shop garbage tin at the sack's bottom, half concealed under the tissue paper? Carefully lifting it, Lake observed that it included a number of objects that appeared to be significantly more important than typical refuse. Only a portion of the letters on a ripped bottle label that stated "Nut Oil" in commercial type is visible. A tiny white till receipt that was crumpled but still readable, with a date from 3 days earlier and the remark "Ground nut oil grosses." Holding out the receipt, Lake remarked, "Now this is interesting. From the grocery store, ground nut oil. Any particular reason you'd be buying cooking oil, Mrs. Finch?" "I assumed your store specialized on haberdashery and wool goods." The lamplight had made Mabel's face quite pallid. "Oh, that. Oil is used for a variety of tasks in the shop, such as lubricating scissors and fixing squeaky hinges. That's nothing out of the ordinary." Lake kept looking through the waste tin's contents, discovering more things that made his heart race with enthusiasm for his job. Several more ticket fragments and what seemed like the remains of a commercial label that had been purposefully ripped apart were among the wreckage. The most incriminating proof, however, came from his finding in the back area of the shop. On a work near the window rested a shallow tray carrying 2 scans of linen yarn. One was still dry and felt normal to the touch, but the other was obviously treated with some sort of oil, as evidenced by its somewhat sticky texture and subtle yet unmistakable nutty scent. "Mrs. Finch," quietly Lake said, "you had better accompany me to the station, I guess. Regarding these matters, Inspector Slack will want to speak with you." At last, Mabel's calm exterior gave down entirely. "It wasn't intended to happen like that," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for anyone to get gravely wounded. It was only meant to serve as a warning, enough to cause her to reconsider her ideas." As Lake gathered the evidence that would be essential to solving the murder of Beatrix Morton, he took special note of this admission. Miss Marple's intuition had hinted to a breakthrough, and the midnight visit to get rid of damning papers had delivered it. Lake couldn't help admiring the elderly woman's wisdom as he walked Mabel out of the store. Miss Marple had grasped a basic aspect of human nature. The offender would eventually strive to destroy evidence out of remorse and fear, and these efforts frequently produced the exact evidence that investigators required. As they made their way to the police station, where Inspector Slack awaited the details of what was sure to be an extremely enlightening interview, the peaceful village street seemed to hold its breath. Finch's haberdashery and wool stood black and empty behind them. In the dim moonlight, its cheery window display suddenly appears to be for a lawn. It was discovered that the quaint world of village trade held far more sinister secrets than anyone could have ever dreamed. As she eventually got ready for bed in the morning, Miss Marple thought, the puzzle's final pieces would probably be in place. The last piece of evidence proving how a straightforward knitting evening had been turned into a murderous occasion had come from the midnight trip. Despite the fact that justice was getting closer, she couldn't help but feel sorry for the person who had been pushed to such extreme lengths by fear and desperation. She understood from extensive experience that the human heart could be both incredibly loving and incredibly dark, and that these two emotions frequently coexisted in the same individual. She would offer a silent prayer tonight for everyone involved, both the victim and the offender, but tomorrow would bring the final revelations. Chapter 8. Label Burn. With a new purpose, Inspector Slack returned to the Institute Hall the morning after Mabel Finch's midnight adventure. He could now look at the crime scene with a far better knowledge of what had truly happened that deadly evening, thanks to the evidence found in the wool shop. Shortly after breakfast, Miss Marple showed up with her knitting bag and the contented look of someone whose beliefs were starting to be supported by hard data. Without introducing herself, she stated, "I hope Sergeant Lake's vigil was successful." Yes, it did. A receipt for groundnut oil that was bought 3 days before to the knitting club meeting is one of the important pieces of the puzzle that Mrs. Finch's attempt to get rid of the evidence has given us. Miss Marple gave a contemplative nod. I had my suspicions, but I think there might be more evidence in the hall itself that we haven't found yet, especially in relation to the fabrication of that label. She made her way to the tiny kitchen at the rear of the institution hall, where a small gas burner was used to provide refreshments for different community events. With a small oven and multiple burner rings that were clearly used frequently, the range was old but well maintained. She opened the oven door and looked inside. If someone needed to dispose of incriminating labels quickly and thoroughly, she added, what better place than a convenient fire? Inspector Slack accompanied her in inspecting the range, observing right away that the interior was worn. A few tiny charred pieces that differed greatly from typical food debris were found. Among the typical buildup of cooking residue, he used tweezers to carefully remove one of the larger pieces and muttered, burnt paper, and noticed that a portion of the letter is still visible. When examined closely, the fragment revealed the spectral remnants of what looked to be commercial printing. The burned background made it difficult to read the letters Lanolene, Miss Marple said contentedly. After taking the original lanolene label off the bottle, someone burned it, most likely to make sure that nothing remained of what the bottle had once held. As they examined the interior of the range, they come upon more pieces that clearly demonstrate the quick disposal. Several little fragments of sticky sticker material, the sort used for product labels, had been crushed to brittle curls by the heat. I wonder when this burning happened, Slack thought. Access to the institute kitchen, and ideally, a period when such activity wouldn't be observed, would have been necessary. Miss Marple gave this some serious thought. The kitchen is available to the knitting group for making tea, and there was undoubtedly enough confusion throughout the evening's activities for someone to have snuck away for a short while without being noticed. They went back to the main hall and focused on the bottle of purported needle conditioner once more. The signs of tampering appeared even more pronounced in the bright morning light. Look at the edges of this label, Miss Marple pointed out. They're remarkably sharp and clean, as if the label had been applied very recently. Give the other goods in Mrs. Finch's shop sample some thought. Their labels reflect the wear and subtle softening that occurs with regular treatment over time. Carefully, she flipped the bottle over and saw a little pencil mark on the label's underside. This is Mrs. Finch's distinctive price pencil mark. To keep track of what has been distributed, she frequently makes small notes on her shop samples. Slack was assembling the evidence into a complete picture. Therefore, 3 days prior to the meeting, Mrs. Finch would be buying groundnut oil. A new label was put on to cover up the contents of the bottle and the burned remnants of what looks to be a lanolene label. Exactly. As we re-examined Mrs. Morton's bamboo needles, Miss Marple proceeded to the spot where Beatrix's knitting supplies were neatly stored as proof. She held the clean cloth to her nose and carefully cleansed the points of the round needles. The smell is definitely nutty. The unique flavor of roasted peanuts, which clings to the linen yarn from package number 7, rather than the woolly smell of real lanolene. She took a closer look at the yarn, observing how some areas had the obvious symptoms of contamination. Look here, Inspector. These specific strands smell like nuts and have that same greasy residue. When knitting, Mrs. Morton would have handled this yarn numerous times, moistening it with her lips as she joined fresh lengths. As Miss Marple proceeded to examine the tangible evidence, Slack took thorough notes. With each fresh finding, the case was getting stronger, but she understood it would need more than method and opportunity alone to establish purposeful intent. As she continued to look over the numbered slips, she added, "We also need to take into account the duplicate ticket that made sure Mrs. Morton received the contaminated yarn. The writing style of the left-handed person is very different. She closely compared the handwriting on the 2 number 7 tickets. "I've noticed that," Mrs. Finch writes in her shop ledger with her left hand. Both Mrs. Trent and Miss Daring are right-handed, and Mrs. Pike's handwriting differs significantly from both of these samples due to her arthritis. The evidence was accumulating methodically, with each piece fitting into a logical pattern that suggested deliberate premeditation as opposed to unintentional contamination. Miss Marple warned, "But we mustn't forget the red herrings. Miss Trent's blatant animosity against her disqualified pattern, Miss Daring's naive oil treatment experiment, and Mrs. Pike's reserved manner that might be used to hide complaints. An investigation could be readily misled by any of them." She stopped by the window and gazed out at the quiet village street where daily life went on according to its usual schedule. The most ingenious aspect of this murder was the way it generated false suspicion by using actual facts. Even though it was just innocuous olive oil, Miss Daring actually did apply oil to her linen. Mrs. Trent's animosity toward Mrs. Morton is genuine. It would be simple to misrepresent these facts to imply guilt when none exists. Although the tangible proof presents a completely different picture, Slack closed his notebook with a feeling of contentment. The receipt for groundnut oil, the pieces of burned label, and the unique handwriting on the duplicate ticket. They are all pointing in the same way. Miss Marple gave a contemplative nod. Yes, they do. Here, a meticulously orchestrated murder is being staged as an unintentional allergic reaction in order to implicate innocent people. She considered how fear and greed had tainted the comfortable world of village crafts. As they got ready to leave the Institute Hall, someone had committed murder using the well-known customs of charitable knitting, thinking that the innocent environment would provide as the ideal backdrop for their lethal scheme. When all the evidence was presented and the truth was eventually exposed, the last confrontation would take place tomorrow. However, Miss Marple would offer up another silent prayer tonight for the administration of justice and the tranquility that results from the eventual discovery of truth among deceit. As they locked the Institute Hall behind them, the afternoon sun was starting to slant through the towering windows, leaving the crime scene to await its last incorrect number in Chapter 9. Miss Marple was working on a light blue pullover for the church charity box in her sitting room the night before the final confrontation. Her knitting needles were going in a steady rhythm as usual. However, she wasn't focused on the straightforward pattern in front of her. Rather, she was meticulously reassembling the series of events that had resulted in Beatrix Morton's demise. Inspector Slack had confirmed over the phone earlier that Maple Finch was being held at the station, but she had only admitted that the scheme had failed. The official meeting, where all the evidence would be presented and the whole truth would be exposed, would take place tomorrow. After putting down her needles, Miss Marple went to her writing desk and started taking thorough notes on the 2 pivotal exchanges that had enabled the murder. Even as she lamented the scheme's lethal intent, the more she thought about the preparation required, the more she was impressed by the meticulous thinking that had gone into it. In the first switch, the needle conditioner bottle's innocuous lanolin had been replaced with lethal groundnut oil. 3 days prior to the meeting, the peanut oil had to be purchased, and the old label had to be carefully removed and replaced. This needed ahead planning. The charred pieces in the Institute kitchen range spoke to how meticulously this deception had been executed. The ingenuity of the strategy and its reliance on a deep understanding of Beatrice Morton's personal habits. And the knitting club's routines, however, were revealed in the second swap. It had come to Miss Marple's attention that Maple Finch had spent the afternoon before the meeting watching Lucy Daring's naive attempt with oil treatment of linen yarn. This was something Lucy herself had brought up, describing how she had read about using oil to soften plant fibers and had tried the method with olive oil from her mother's kitchen. Mabel had realized that this pre-treated yarn would offer the ideal allergen delivery system, which is what made her plan so deviously clever. In order to guarantee that the tainted yarn would come into close contact with her mouth, Beatrice Morton was known for moistening the ends of her yarn with her lips when joining new lengths. In the chaos of the mystery skein drawing, the ticket swap had been carried out with stunning daring. In the midst of the chaos and excitement of the evening, Mabel had managed to replace Beatrice's original draw with a duplicate number 7 ticket that she had produced using her left hand, which matched her natural writing style. While taking notes, Miss Marple took a moment to think on the psychological impact of the crime. The ability to act naturally while carrying out each phase of the homicidal strategy had been necessary, in addition to meticulous planning and in-depth understanding of the victim's habits. Throughout the actual evening, Mabel had been free to walk around the space, providing her with useful items and support in the manner that everyone had grown accustomed to from the kind store owner. In order to avoid squeaky bamboo needles, a issue that any seasoned knitter would appreciate having resolved, the needle conditioner had been offered as a considerate gift. Beatrix needles had been contaminated under the pretense of useful demonstration. Mabel had likely murmured, "Just a dab to stop the squeak," as she delicately applied the lethal peanut oil to the bamboo tips. The helpful assistance with tea service had then given them more chances to make sure the contamination was complete. Beatrice started exhibiting the initial symptoms of an allergic response just a few minutes after using the contaminated yarn and treated needles. Despite Dr. Haydock's prompt attention, the progression had been rapid and eventually fatal. Miss Marple thought about how Holly's thoughtfully set tea table had initially raised all suspicions. This diversion had been part of the plan's ingenuity. Everyone was aware of Beatrix's severe nut allergy and the safety measures that needed to be taken when cooking for her. It had appeared nearly impossible that knitting supplies, rather than food, could be the source of contamination. The red herrings had offered additional concealment for the underlying crime. Hazel Trent was a clear suspect for anyone searching. For personal motivations, because of her blatant bitterness about her disqualifying pattern, it would be easy to interpret Lucy Daring's oil treatment experiment as proof of guilty knowing. Even Edith Pike's usual silence could be seen as hiding secrets or resentment, but the physical proof was far more convincing. The burned label fragments in the Institute kitchen, the groundnut oil receipt discovered during Mabel's midnight disposal attempt, the new-looking fake needle conditioner label, and the unique left-handed writing on the duplicate ticket all suggested deliberate premeditation as opposed to unintentional contamination or a crime of passion. Miss Marple went back to knitting, but her mind was still on the human tragedy that had transpired in the village institute, which she knew well. Someone had corrupted the innocent joy of doing good deeds with lethal intent by committing murder. In the knitting club's comfortable, trustworthy environment, her thoughts were interrupted when the phone rang. Inspector Slack reported on the events of the evening with a note of weary satisfaction in his voice. "At last, Mrs. Finch has consented to give a thorough statement tomorrow morning. The evidence speaks for itself, despite her continued insistence that it was never intended to be fatal and was only a warning to get Mrs. Morton to change her mind." "Yes, it does," said Miss Marple softly. "However, I have a suspicion that her goal went beyond merely wanting to warn. Fear has the power to push people to extreme lengths, especially when their means of subsistence are in jeopardy." She hung up and put her needles back, working slowly on the lovely blue wool while thinking about the terrible waste of the last several days. A community rocked by the realization that murder might be hiding beneath the surface of their tranquil rural routines, one life lost, another destroyed. The last chapter of this tragic tale would be written tomorrow, when justice would be done and all the facts would be presented. She would, however, finish another row of stitches tonight and offer a silent prayer for everyone involved, both the victim and the offender. Over St. Mary Me, the fall evening settled calmly, but the placid exterior was no longer able to conceal the sinister currents that flowed beneath the village's refined exterior. Miss Marple had witnessed such depravity before, and she was aware that for as long as she lived, she would be surprised and saddened by the human ability for both generosity and evil. But at least the truth would be revealed tomorrow. Chapter 10. The Bindoff Disclosure. The day of the last revelation began with a gloomy and muted dawn, as though the weather itself mirrored the solemn tone of the assembly that would soon be held in the Institute Hall. Miss Marple showed up early with her knitting bag, and the sad face that befitted such a serious event. The room was thoughtfully set up by Inspector Slack, with chairs facing the table in a semicircle and all the evidence arranged in a methodical manner. Beatrix Morton's tainted knitting supplies, the burned pieces from the cooking range, the brown bottle with its fake label, and the duplicate tickets all silently described their meticulous preparation and lethal execution. The knitting club's remaining members poured into the hall one by one, their faces displaying the stress of the previous few days. The Reverend and Mrs. Clement, whose kind presence offered a note of consolation in the trying circumstances, arrived after Lady Bantry, who arrived with her customary flair, but in a more reserved manner. Hazel Trent came in silently, her face white with concern, her dark hair drawn back sharply. Lucy Daring appeared frightened and extremely young, obviously overwhelmed by the seriousness of the situation. With her hands securely folded in her lap, Edith Pike sat down in her usual peaceful spot in the back. In addition, Dr. Haddock was there after being called upon to offer medical testimony regarding Beatrix Morton's cause of death. His anguish at losing a patient in such a horrible situation was not entirely hidden by his professional manner. Mabel Finch, who appeared much older than her years and was escorted by Sergeant Lake, arrived last. It was as though the happy, busy store owner who had been such a familiar presence in village life had disappeared, to be replaced by a woman whose face was marked with obvious signs of anguish and remorse. Inspector Slack stood up to speak to the gathered crowd, his tone official and serious enough for the situation. "We have convened this morning, ladies and gentlemen, to examine the evidence related to Mrs. Beatrix Morton's death. Investigations have shown that what first seemed to be a tragic accident was actually intentional murder. Though most had already suspected it, a collective gasp of breath echoed through the room. It was still startling to hear it said so bluntly. Slack went on to say that Miss Marple has played a crucial role in revealing the reality of what transpired that night. I think she's the best person to explain how this horrible crime was committed." Slowly, Miss Marple stood up, holding her knitting bag tightly like a lucky charm. She surveyed the room with the soft melancholy that characterized her discoveries of human immorality. She said quietly, "The method used in poor Mrs. Morton's murder was both cruel and clever. It took advantage of her severe nut allergy, her knitting habits, and the friendly environment of our charity event." She walked over to the evidence table and pointed to the fake needle conditioner bottle. This bottle of ground nut oil masquerading as innocuous lanolene was the murder weapon, if we may use that term. 3 days prior to our appointment, Mrs. Finch bought the peanut oil and carefully rebranded it to seem like needle conditioner. Though she didn't object, Mabel Finch's head lowered. Mrs. Morton's knitting needles, which were coated with this lethal oil under the pretense of beneficial maintenance, served as the delivery method. When attaching new lengths of yarn, Mrs. Morton had the knitter's habit of moistening it with her lips. She only needed to come into contact with the tainted yarn and needles to have a deadly allergic response. The duplicate ticket with the number 7 was picked up by Miss Marple. The real ingenuity of the scheme, however, was in making sure Mrs. Morton got yarn that had been oil-treated beforehand. Miss Daring had unintentionally experimented with using olive oil to soften linen, which resulted in the ideal delivery method. A duplicate ticket written in Mrs. Finch's characteristic left-handed script was substituted to ensure Mrs. Morton received this particular package. Lucy Daring gasped in horror. You mean it was made possible by my experiment? My dear, you're innocent. Action was taken advantage of, but you are not accountable for the consequences. Someone who turned innocuous acts into lethal intent is solely to blame. As she went on, Miss Marple's tone softened. Financial desperation and a fear of being discovered were the driving forces behind this horrible act, Mrs. Morton had found. Systematic skimming of the knitting club's funds, inflated bills, subpar supplies masquerading as expensive ones, and anomalies in the yarn fund. She turned to face Mabel Finch, whose shoulders trembled with unspoken tears. That afternoon, Mrs. Morton had told Mrs. Finch that the club would be relocating its account from the shop and that she would be presenting a comprehensive audit at the following meeting. This would have meant financial collapse at a time when business was already challenging and winter was coming. Slack, the inspector, came forward. When we looked through the shop's records, we discovered proof of the financial irregularities. Mrs. Morton had every reason to be suspicious. Miss Marple walked over to where Beatrix's incomplete baby vest was lying in the mess. The fact that this crime tainted something lovely is what makes it so tragic. When Mrs. Morton passed away, she was making charity baby clothing. Her final, conscious deed was one of kindness and generosity. With the exception of Mabel Finch's soft sobbing, the room had become very quiet. "Mrs. Finch," murmured Miss Marple softly, "would you like to tell us in your own words what happened?" Mabel looked up, tears running down her cheeks. She muttered, it was only meant to frighten her. Only enough to make her sick, to warn her of the consequences of carrying out her plans. I didn't intend it to be lethal. I assumed that a brief touch would be enough to make her feel ill. Dr. Haddock sadly shook his head. Mrs. Morton had a very bad allergy. It may have been fatal to come into contact with peanut oil. "Now I know that," Abel cried. "I was desperate, though. I've never had anything but the shop. I am nothing without it." I reasoned that she might reconsider going through with the audit. If she got sick, Miss Marple's tone was firm but gentle. For someone as sensitive as Mrs. Morton, a small amount of peanut oil is a lot. It was always going to be a deadly outcome. Using his handcuffs, Inspector Slack advanced. "Mabel Finch, I've arrested you for Beatrice Morton's murder and for embezzlement of the knitting club's money." The rest of the group sat in stunned silence as Mabel was led away. The discovery of such meticulous preparation and lethal intent had permanently altered the comfortable world of their knitting club. After gathering her knitting bag and getting ready to go, Miss Marple stopped at the door to speak to the remaining members. "The money from the club will be given back, and you'll want to keep up Mrs. Morton's good deeds." She would have preferred that the baby clothes be completed. Lady Bantry murmured, "To think someone could kill at a knitting meeting." Miss Marple smoothed her gloves thoughtfully. "Clubs, my dear Dolly, are made of habits. Change one habit and you can tie a very deadly knot indeed." As she walked home through the quiet village streets, Miss Marple reflected on how easily trust could be betrayed, and how the familiar routines of civilized life could be corrupted by fear and greed. But she also thought of Beatrice Morton's unfinished baby vest, and how the simple act of knitting for charity would continue despite this terrible interruption. Justice had been served, but the real healing would come from the gradual restoration of trust and the quiet continuation of good works in Beatrice Morton's memory.